Before kingdoms, before borders, there was hunger. Not the hunger of one creature, but of a species growing too fast. For generations, survival meant moving on. But one day, there was nowhere left to go. Herds moved farther, foods vanished, rivers shrank. Survival stopped being personal. It became a crisis. At first, they shared. Then, they watched each other. What if survival doesn't belong to everyone? Tools stopped being tools. Eyes stopped searching for animals and began tracking humans. Silence became strategy and their greatest protection. The land became a prize, worth risking everything. Fear changed shape, becoming something far more dangerous. The first attack began with waiting and watching. This was the moment they stopped surviving nature and began confronting each other. The land did not change overnight, but the warning had begun. It changed slowly, quietly, and without mercy. For generations, survival meant moving on before it was too late. Fire saved them, tools fed them, and more children lived than ever before. What once felt like progress was quietly becoming pressure. The valleys emptied, and the herds stopped returning for good. Hunger arrived quietly and refused to leave. At first, it was ignored. Then it was deeply felt. The endless land was beginning to feel small. Movement, once the answer, was now becoming dangerous. They were not strangers. They were reflections of survival. Food was no longer simply found. It had to be defended. The question was no longer survival, but who was using what they needed most. For the first time in their existence, land itself meant power. The next decision would not be made by nature, but by human will. Population did not grow evenly. It suddenly exploded beyond balance. Fire reduced death. Tools reduced effort. Shared knowledge reduced fatal mistakes. But the land did not expand. It could not keep pace with them. 20 became 50, and 50 quickly became far too many. Food was scarce, not because nature failed, but because human success carried consequences. Herds moved farther away, and even the rivers seemed to grow silent. Another group was eating what they desperately needed to survive. They had never feared each other until hunger reshaped the meaning of fear. Territory was marked by presence alone, never by words. When two groups met, there was no language and no agreement. They measured strength, numbers, and the will to stand firm. Stones were thrown to frighten, not yet to kill. Memory remained, and memory quietly sharpened hunger into caution. Stone was shaped for weight, for balance, for something far more dangerous. And then the idea formed quietly that land was not only defended, it could be taken. Violence did not arrive suddenly. It approached in silence. It arrived carefully, almost too quietly to notice. No one spoke of attack, yet the idea already existed between them. They had always reacted to danger. Now they were beginning to prepare for it. Scouts moved farther than ever before. not searching for animals, but for rivals. Other camps were studied patiently, always from a careful distance. They learned the patterns, when they left, who stayed, where the vulnerable slept. Information became more valuable than food itself. The Watchers gained influence because they saw danger first. Plans began to form, even without language. The group quietly changed shape, becoming harder to surprise. Tools were no longer shaped only to cut, but to strike with force. Training had begun long before it was ever named. Movement once saved them, now holding ground meant survival. The next encounter would not be accidental, it would be deliberate. Tools had always been honest, built only for survival. And then, that honesty began to change quietly. No ritual, no language, only a growing intention. Sharpness no longer mattered as much. Weight became everything. Not to cut flesh anymore, but to shatter bone with force. Wood was strengthened by fire, extending reach beyond bare hands. For the first time, these weapons were not meant for prey. They practiced quietly, without ever saying why. Their aim shifted upward, toward the eyes of a threat. Not to fight long battles, but to end resistance quickly. For the first time in memory, power became visible. Paths once avoided for generations were now carefully tested. The very first weapon was lifted out of fear. When the blow finally came, it felt like terrible necessity. From that moment forward, the land was no longer shared. The decision was not made in anger, but in quiet survival instinct. No one spoke it aloud, yet somehow everyone understood the risk. The river that once sustained them all could no longer provide enough. They watched patiently, learning rhythm over many long days. They waited carefully until the camp was at its weakest. They moved in darkness just before the world awakened. Fear was still there, but now it was tightly controlled. Everything now favored surprise, even the silent wind. The first strike came from behind, fast and without warning. Panic spread instantly, faster than understanding. Weapons moved without hesitation, driven by raw necessity. Children were not chased. Survival demanded speed. The violence ended almost as suddenly as it began. They took what meant survival and nothing more. They returned changed because violence had proven it could work. Violence did not end with the attack. It stayed in the air. Nothing felt the same, not even survival itself. Food returned, but peace never followed it. Sleep came slowly and never stayed long. Hands stayed close to weapons, even in daylight. They remembered the sound, the moment bone broke. They feared what they had become and what it meant. Elsewhere, the survivors gathered quietly and prepared to move. They buried nothing. There was no time to mourn. They moved. Grief hardened inside them and slowly turned into resolve. They began watching again, counting shapes, waiting for patterns. The lesson spread quietly, written into muscle memory and survival instinct. Weapons stayed visible because letting go no longer felt safe. Slowly hardening, survival meant one thing now: remain alert through every darkness. Violence was no longer unexpected. It had become part of morning awareness. Every step carried intent now. Movement itself demanded awareness. Watching was no longer occasional. It became constant survival behavior. The land was not mapped, but presence quietly divided it. If you were seen there often, the land was understood to be taken already. Encounters were no longer accidents. They were anticipated moments of risk. Before sound or gesture, the weapons themselves carried the warning. Protection stopped being reactive. It became immediate survival instinct. Without planning it, bodies fell into roles shaped by survival. The clashes grew shorter, faster, brutally efficient for survival. Victory meant forcing retreat, not chasing destruction. Loss reshaped behavior, carving itself into memory. Some learned dominance through where they stood. The world began sorting them by how they survived. The land belonged to those who could hold it and endure. Strength alone was no longer enough. Not anymore. Survival demanded something harder, awareness beyond strength. You don't control nature, you learn to guide it. Predators were no longer just fear, they became signals. They learned where beasts hunted and when to move. Paths were influenced quietly, guiding others toward unseen danger. Noise was no longer accidental, it was released carefully. Fear completed the danger long before contact. Some animals weren't driven away, their presence was allowed. They reacted before humans sensed it, becoming living alarms. Fear created space, and space began to feel like protection. The land revealed advantages, and they learned where to remain. Sometimes being seen was enough. Violence no longer required contact. But nature obeyed nothing and punished carelessness instantly. Without words or rulers, a silent hierarchy had begun to form. Dominance eased hunger, at least for now. But it created something else, a heavy silence. The land felt stable, familiar, almost predictable. Those who held ground slept lightly and listened. Power always draws eyes, even from far away. The defeated did not vanish, they adapted to survive. They grew harder, leaner, shaped by scarcity. Some endured quietly, surviving on the dangerous edges. Violence did not disappear, it simply found new directions. Those born into dominance accepted it as the natural order. Before trust could form, awareness came first. Without notice, something softer began to fade. Guarding continued, even after need had passed. What was held could always be taken by others waiting. They secured survival, yet lost something unnamed along the way. The First War passed, yet the land still carried its marks. After movement faded, the marks remained on the ground. Across changing seasons, the same ground drew them back. High ground offered sight, and sight increased survival. Where water, cover, and passage met, survival strengthened. They entered a world already shaped by hardened survival. Familiar bodies drew closer. Unfamiliar ones changed direction. Close ground reduced surprise. Distance increased danger. Tools grew heavier, shaped by encounters that demanded force. Where paths narrowed, the same collisions returned. A sharper awareness emerged, and it favored advantage. As resources grew, ease did not return with them. The great dangers faded, and humans adjusted to the silence. The pattern endured, quietly repeating across generations. One question remained, deciding who held ground and who yielded it. The First War ended, but its memory learned how to survive.